Choosing freedom, choosing religion, that was a choice made by African Americans decades ago and still to this day. Here in the historical district of Philadelphia, there's so much to remind America of its independence. I thought it was only fitting maybe to talk about independence, but in another way. There are so many commemorations here about slavery and what that meant to African Americans. It's been a big learning experience to me as well. Walking through the city, I've spent so much time learning about Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. I want to look at African American pioneers and in a completely different light. Now you can see the First Amendment right next to me, and what an amazing description this is. One of the things on my tour of America, what I've seen, and where my focus has really come down to, is how African Americans took up Islam. Now particularly, Philadelphia is renowned for its jazz, and I want to talk about Talib Dawud, who became one of the largest pioneers and converters of Muslims in America. When I started my work, I really wanted to focus on the early pioneers of Islam in America who spread it. And there were whole separate classes of people. There were of course the early missionaries. But what about someone like Talib Dawud? I want us to understand a bit more about the musicians and the impact some of these pioneers had on Islam in America. He arrived in New York. He played with Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, so he was by no means a small musician. He became one of the progenitors of the whole plethora of R&B musicians, whether that was Kenny Clark, whether that was Aliyah Rabia, whether that was Yusuf Lateef. And we should talk about women as well. Aliyah Rabia, she became a Muslim too. She was otherwise known as Dakota Staton. But let's talk a little bit about what he did. He left music altogether, and he was well accomplished in that field as well, playing with Duke Ellington. He then became a Muslim, an Ahmadi Muslim in fact. Now, why is he not talked about in the same breath as Malcolm X? I don't know, if I'm really honest with you. Perhaps clearly he didn't have the same fame, the same spectacular rhetoric that Malcolm did. I think he's someone that potentially could be mentioned in the same breath as Malcolm X. He left music, yet Malcolm X had an interest in music. It wasn't just that, he wasn't just a force of propagation of Islam. He established Islamic institutions. He linked that with Africa too, no different to Malcolm. Travelled to Middle East and Africa, no different to Malcolm. He spent time in the Middle East and Africa. He formed his own Muslim network. He formed his own Pan-African network too. He was a strong vocal critic of Islam that he felt that was not orthodox. So these are some of the things that we should be talking about in the conversation of Islam in America. People still talk about him to this day. We're talking decades later, people still talk about Talib Dawud's library collection in Philadelphia. The brothers and sisters that I've talked to remember him with quite a loving heart. He was intelligent, well-read, dedicated, committed. He pushed Islam further than probably anyone else did in his area. To be clear, Talib Dawud didn't just focus on pushing Islam to itself as well. He also married Aliyah Rabia, or better known as Dakota Staton. She was a popular singer, a string of hits which hit the charts. These things that I've seen in America is that choosing freedom, choosing religion, that was a choice made by African Americans decades ago and still to this day. Those that came, they chose learning. Some of them chose music. Some of them chose to go into the streets. Some of them chose to build mosques. Some of them chose to give their houses away. And these are all hallmarks of the Ahmadi Muslim community. When it comes to the musicians and what we're talking about here, Talib Dawud was just one of them. We could talk about Yusuf Lateef, Ahmed Jamal, just two of them who won Grammys, but what about the dozens of others?